The morning light on the tarmac was new and clean, pouring across the glossy fuselage of the private jet like an unasked-for blessing. Passengers moved with the practiced economy of seasoned travelers. Shoes slipped off, phones came out, conversations started and stuttered. Among them walked Marcus Grant, a man whose presence was measured rather than announced, who carried himself like someone who had once been taught to lead by listening. Marcus wore a light blue shirt, open at the collar, sleeves rolled to just below the elbow as if to tell the world he was ready for hands-on work rather than podium speeches. A thin leather briefcase swung at his side. To anyone scanning boarding passes and faces, he looked like a moderate-success businessman, perhaps a consultant, maybe an investor. He was none of those things to a truly informed observer. Marcus was the founder and majority owner of Garrison Logistics, a company that had, in the prior decade, turned a fledgling freight matcher into a towering platform controlling fleet assignments for hundreds of private and commercial operators. This particular aircraft, Flight 327, was part of a small fleet under agreement with Garrison to move the company's executives and key clients. Marcus had intentionally booked himself under a regular passenger card, wanting to watch an ordinary flight, to see how staff treated people without titles pinned on their chests. That morning his plan was simple. Observe, take notes, and then fly home. The jet's captain, Captain Eleanor Rhodes, met passengers at the small doorway like a stage manager. Rhodes wore her uniform with the crisp precision of a person who believed that rules were the scaffolding of safety. Her jaw was squared, her eyes practiced in the neutral authority of someone who had spent thousands of hours behind a yoke. When she glanced at Marcus's ticket and then at Marcus himself, there was a micro-expression, a barely perceptible narrowing of the eyes. And the assumption landed before she spoke. "Sir," she said without greeting, "first class is reserved for our confirmed executive passengers." Her tone was clipped and categorical. Marcus extended the small square of laminated paper, offered a smile and said, "There must be some mistake. That seat was listed as available when I booked." Captain Rhodes didn't so much as look at the ticket. As if the badge of an assumption could replace the facts printed on paper. "I can't allow you up front," she replied. "Please take a seat in the rear." There was an awkward hush, a pain-free kind of violence in the specificity of her words. The cabin glanced. A stewardess stilled, chewing the inside of her cheek as if to hold back a comment. Marcus bowed an infinitesimal nod and moved to the chosen back row like a man who had been trained to endure small humiliations on behalf of observing truths. He slid into an aisle seat, opened a small notepad, and began to write in calm, deliberate strokes. Observation, to him, was a leadership tool. Leadership, he believed, was not a display of power but an insistence on truth. As the doors closed and the jet's engines moved from idle to roar, Marcus's pen scratched the first lines. Inside, the bright tarmac seemed at odds with the chill that had settled in that cabin. Inside, people resumed their conversations, but the tenor had changed. Where there had been casual anticipation, there was now the raw texture of unease, as if everyone in that small space had been asked to hold their breath. When the jet reached altitude, the cabin lights softened and the pilot's voice came through the intercom with professional authority. Captain Rhodes's announcement was a practiced cadence. Flight path, expected turbulence, expected arrival time, but there was a clipped undertone, the sort a person uses when they are reminding themselves of control. Marcus listened, then readied his laptop. He wasn't done observing. He began to comb through public filings on his tablet. Nothing illicit, just open corporate documents and the charter company's published service reviews, and he cross-referenced the complaints filed under the alias the company used for feedback. He found a pattern, not of catastrophic failure but of brittle, recurring rudeness. Terse interactions, brusque corrections, air of superiority toward customers the staff deemed lesser. It wasn't enough, by itself, to bring a firings roster down on anyone's head. But Marcus, trained by decades of building company cultures where small corrosive behaviors spread like mold, recognized a hazard. Behavior like that corrodes teams, fractures trust, and, in aviation, where a minute decision can ripple into catastrophe, the stakes are higher than in a boardroom. Yet Marcus did not act on impulse. The plane's hum filled the pauses between his keystrokes and the muted murmurs of fellow passengers. A woman in a navy blazer, the kind of client who kept a notepad just in case she needed leverage, murmured to a partner about how some people were presumptuous on private flights. A man in a heavy suit leaned his head back and watched the cabin ceiling as if it were a sky to be judged. Marcus scribbled down the flight number, the captain's name, and the timestamps of his notes. When the stewardess came by offering bottles of water and warm smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes, she hung at his row a fraction longer than she needed to, briefly catching his eye and offering, not a complaint but a small human admission, "She can be rough." Marcus nodded and said, "Always tell the truth on the feedback form." She gave him a look that mixed curiosity and fear and then moved on. There were other tiny fissures, too. A tray table dropped without an apology, a curt correction when someone mispronounced a name, a refusal to accommodate a minor dietary need. All small things. But as Marcus observed, his mind collected them into a mosaic. The captain's authority was clean and unyielding, but it bore the brittle edges of disdain. The cabin, a temporary ecosystem, began to reveal where hierarchy had calcified into contempt. Marcus closed his laptop, feeling the pressure of something larger than a bad boarding policy. In a world where people would assume his place based on his skin if they recognized who he was, the reverse, being assumed lesser, was a poison that ate dignity. He remembered his mother's words. "You watch how people treat the janitor and you know how they'll treat you when you need them." He decided then that he would not let a pattern persist unnoticed. At 12 minutes before the event that would fracture the rest of the morning, a small commotion started near the rear galley. A passenger had discovered a settled child asleep but restless, and the parent asked for a blanket. The stewardess, apparently unfamiliar with the woman's frequent flyer status, courteously obliged. Captain Rhodes's head tilted toward the back in a motion that suggested annoyance rather than concern. Her hands tightened on the yoke for a beat longer than necessary. Passengers rarely notice such micro-movements, but Marcus did. Talent for reading those details belonged to people who had built companies from ground up. You learned early on to notice how leaders' bodies betrayed emotion. The captain tapped the mic and announced that the flight would remain at cruising altitude for a little longer due to air traffic congestion. Her voice was clipped. The emphasis fell on the procedurality of the decision, not its human consequences. A businessman near Marcus huffed and tossed a folded paper into the seat pocket, irritated at the delay. Marcus, however, noticed a different thing, a tension in Rhodes's shoulders that suggested stress beneath the armor. He suspected fatigue, perhaps overdue maintenance worries she'd had on her mind, or a life outside the cockpit pressing against her professional composure. That made him think less about malice and more about fractures, how people carry stress and displace it. His hands hovered over the notepad as though writing might catch and hold a sense of shape in a world that otherwise blurred. He leaned back and surveyed the cabin, registering an increasing chorus of small irritations. A parent apologizing for a fussy child, a retired couple quieted by the hum of mechanical constancy, a man typing an angry email about the delay in his inbox. These were ordinary human notes in a song of travel. But for Marcus, nothing about ordinary traveled in isolation. Systems he'd learned were vulnerable at seams. Captain Rhodes moved with precision. She had hours of logged experience. But experience without empathy can harden into an inability to see the human before you. Marcus folded his hands. He did not plan dramatic gestures. He didn't want a scene. He wanted to document truth and to do something proportionate and exact if the truth demanded it. He considered known protocols and the legal frames. As an aircraft owner, he had contractual relationship rights. As an airline passenger, he had civil recourses. But he also had years of watching small injustices calcify. He remembered the last time he'd stayed silent, a client meeting where demeaning jokes went unchallenged and later metastasized into accepted banter. Silence then had been expensive. He would not let silence compound this morning. When the moment came, it arrived not as a shout but as a moment that increased in pressure like a storm behind glass. Marcus, who had kept his head down and his observations written in his ever-present notebook, was approached by an elderly passenger who had a tremor in his hands and asked whether the captain would allow him to switch to a window seat. He had a fear of closed spaces. The stewardess, the same kind woman who had earlier received Marcus's small counsel, smiled apologetically and told him there were no open window seats. Captain Rhodes's head inclined just slightly, and then she added, decisively and without a hint of softness, "Sir, we have a seating policy and you'll have to remain where you are." The elderly man's face fell. There was a brittle quality to the captain's adherence to policy that did not discriminate between safety and simple administration. Marcus rose from his seat. He did not storm forward or raise his voice. Instead, he walked with the quiet force of someone who moves to close a wound. Approached the captain at the front and said politely, "Captain Rhodes, I wanted to understand why I was denied the seat up front when I booked it." She looked up at him as if he were a passive element in her ordered world and said flatly, "Sir, the seat is reserved. Please take your assigned place." Her eyes lingered on his chest and back as if she were evaluating the relevance of his words to her authority. Marcus felt an old ache of recognition. Countless times he had watched people assume his place before he had a chance to claim it, and countless times he had chosen to be gracious rather than angry. But that morning something in him had grown less tolerant of being seen as lesser by default. His voice remained even. He did not shout. "Captain, I am the owner of the charter agreement that placed this aircraft here today," he said, the words coming out as fact. The cabin hushed. In that stillness one could hear the low whir of the ventilation and the barely audible creak of a seat hinge. Rhodes's chest tightened. She gave a quiet laugh that recognized none of the weight in his statement. "That would be impossible without identification," she said. "And even then, policies exist." Marcus took a breath. "Captain, I'll show you my credentials." He reached into his briefcase, produced a company badge and a signed letter authorizing him to audit the flight. Her face shifted in that microsecond between disbelief and denial. When she finally took the documents, her shoulders tightened further. She read, eyes racing across the text, then looked up at him, and in a voice that mixed irritation and small triumph said, "This is a misunderstanding on the check-in. I'll make the adjustments." For most, that would have been an end. But as she stepped aside a passenger in the front row, a man who had earlier murmured how some people acted like they owned more than they did, smirked, and Rhodes's expression hardened into something that carried malice for the first time that morning. She was not just enforcing policy. She was correcting an affront in a way that sought to reassert a hierarchy. Marcus understood then that this was no longer merely about a seat. The moment had escalated into an emblem of deeper conduct, the will to be seen and the will to deny that sight. In the immediate seconds after the captain's brusque correction, the ambient noise of the jet became background to a tightened soundtrack of moral choices. Marcus felt the hum of the engines as if in his own body, steady and unyielding. He returned to his seat, the leather protesting softly beneath him, and opened his laptop. He did not seek drama. He sought accountability. Marcus did what he had done for a living. He evaluated the data and the people. He accessed the charter company's maintenance logs, the crew schedules, and the flight's manifest, all things an owner with authorized access could lawfully view. He noticed discrepancies. A flagged maintenance item that had been marked as completed, though the timestamp matched a different aircraft. A crew rest log that indicated the pilot's duty day was longer than permitted by policy in certain overlapping schedules. The facts, when gathered, were a kind of telescopic clarity. Small errors compounded into systemic risk. Marcus's training told him that the right action would be precise and measured, not theatrical. He called the number for the charter operations desk from his phone. The woman who answered did not recognize his voice and informed him that operations had no record of a problem. Marcus asked calmly to be connected to the regional manager. There was a pause and then the line connected. When the manager answered, Marcus identified himself, explained the discrepancies. and requested an immediate safety review and an administrative hold on the aircraft until a supervisor could confirm the logs. His words were crisp, corporate, and devoid of theatricality. He wasn't asking to punish anyone for a perceived slight. He was requesting a compliance check. The operations manager, hearing the owner's voice and seeing the script of events on his end, replied that the captain had already filed the maintenance as complete and that there was no reason to ground the aircraft. The manager's voice contained the bureaucratic calm of someone who had aligned incentives with expediency. Marcus listened, then said, "Please escalate this to a formal safety audit. I am requesting an immediate ground hold until someone with aviation oversight can confirm." The man hesitated, conscious now of liability and of the name that carried weight. Marcus could feel the air shift. Silence in a corporate ether is always a kind of compression. Decisions compact and then explode. In the cabin, Captain Rhodes, unaware of the call being made, moved with measured authority, checking instruments and speaking to her co-pilot with the economy of practiced motions. She was an expert in her field, undoubtedly, and there are many kinds of excellence. But excellence without humility can be brittle. It can make people mistake rule for virtue. Marcus had no desire for retribution. He desired the restoration of right practice. He wanted the systems that govern the few hundred lives in that metal cylinder to be validated against the highest standards. The operations manager, perhaps smelling the danger of escalation, paused and said he would request the audit. The next words would change the tone of the day. It took only 12 minutes from when Marcus dialed for the operations desk to when a directive from corporate came down the line. Initiate a safety hold and return to the gate for a formal inspection. The message hit the cabin with the force of a gavel. Captain Rhodes's face went through a spectrum of expressions only a professional under pressure can map. Surprise, forced composure, then a flash of anger. She announced to the passengers that due to a required safety inspection they would return to the gate and await further instructions. There were groans, then a ripple of resigned acceptance. Air travel, even private travel, is a choreography of interruptions. But the captain's voice carried an edge now that was not merely professional. It was personal. As the aircraft taxied back toward the terminal, Marcus sat very still. He had not come to humiliate anyone. He had come to ensure safety and dignity. At the gate, ground crews surrounded the plane with practiced thoroughness. Inspectors checked manifests, maintenance tags, and the log entries that Marcus had flagged. They opened maintenance panels and scanned serial numbers, looking for the discrepancies Marcus had noted. The process was methodical. Technicians murmuring into radios, grease-stained gloves checking torque and pressure, a printout checked against a digital readout. Somewhere in the midst of the mechanical ballet, Captain Rhodes disembarked and walked toward the operations trailer. Marcus followed at a measured distance. He did not run. He did not shout. He watched her from behind as if reading the shape of a person by their walk. She spoke with the regional operations manager in a closed door for a time long enough that the cabin emptied and the boarding ramp stood exposed to the cloudy sky. When Captain Rhodes emerged, she wore a face that was both defiant and diminished. She had been a professional confronted with the possibility that her record might reveal more than she wanted visible. The operations manager approached Marcus and said, in a voice lowered by the ethics of corporate formality, that the inspection had revealed administrative discrepancies significant enough to warrant immediate suspension of the pilot pending further review. Marcus felt no triumph. What he felt was a weight settling into his shoulders, the weight of responsibility. The charter company's counsel arrived and explained that, as the owner-operator agreement signatory, Marcus had the authority to instruct the temporary grounding until corrected documentation and a recertification could be completed. He signed the hold orders with a pen that clacked in the quiet. That moment, when ink dried on a decision intended to prioritize safety and integrity over reputation or convenience, would come to be the fulcrum upon which the rest of the story would pivot. The day that followed was an ugly, cleansing thing. Captain Rhodes, given the chance to explain, offered a defense that sounded procedural. She had been operating within the policies and had no knowledge of any real hazard. But the inspection produced not just administrative irregularities but evidence of patterns. maintenance entries backdated without technician signatures, rest logs that teetered near allowable limits but contained suspicious gaps, and notes of curt interactions with passengers about their seating that an auditor catalogued as above and beyond enforcement of policy. The internal review, swift because the matter involved a contract holder, recommended immediate suspension and a thorough HR and safety investigation. Marcus was not a man who gorged on headlines. He asked to meet privately with the captain in a closed office. He listened. She explained her background, early flights in austere conditions, a childhood that taught her to command for survival, and a belief that strictness had saved lives. Marcus acknowledged those facts. He said simply, "Captain Rhodes, your training and experience are not in question. But the pattern of decisions, the way you interact with the people on your aircraft, and the lapses found on our audit create risk. Risk in aviation isn't just mechanical. It's cultural. It's the way people are treated when small mistakes happen. It's the way a tired pilot might not feel safe to speak up. We can't allow that." There was a long silence. Rhodes's shoulders clumped, not in surrender but in recognition. Marcus made the decision that would inflame the morning's headlines and perhaps always be debated. He terminated her contract with a charter firm effective immediately. The word "fired" in that context carried judicial weight rather than cruelty. He explained it to her like an executive explaining a strategic pivot, with ordinances of safety and contractual language. Outside, people murmured, meaning lines blurred between justice and spectacle. Social media would later render the moment into 10-second clips and outraged columns, but in that office it was quiet and legal and human. Marcus asked the operations manager to initiate leadership recalibration training, mandatory empathy workshops, and a review of cultural hiring practices across the partner firms. He insisted that corrective action be systemic, not merely the substitution of one person for another. To his staff he said plainly, "If we demand of others the standards we don't embody, we will create a system of people who fear rather than trust. We must be better." He signed the termination papers with a hand that did not tremble. It was a business decision, yes, but it was also a moral one. A deliberate, disciplined choice to treat safety and dignity as inseparable. What followed in the weeks after the incident was both predictable and instructive. There were op-eds and angry op-eds. Commentators who equated the grounding and firing with privilege, and others who declared it overdue justice. Marcus watched the reactions without relish. He continued doing the work he always had, rebuilding trust where it had frayed. The charter company instituted mandatory de-escalation training, audited all maintenance logs, and implemented a third-party oversight committee with authority to review anomalies. Passengers reported more courteous treatment and a transparency in incident reporting that did not exist before. For the captain, there were legal appeals, of course, and long conversations with union representatives and attorneys. There were also opportunities to re-examine training philosophies, and over time she accepted a role as an instructor in a program that taught pilots not only how to fly but how to lead crews with humility. Marcus, who could have used the incident to beef up his public image, chose instead to write a brief internal missive to his firm. "We are owners not just of assets but of standards. The smallest allowances we make for disrespect or carelessness compound into a culture we may regret. If we are to lead, we must correct. If we are to govern, we must do so justly." He donated time and funds to aviation safety groups that promoted cultural competency and mental health resources for crew. The story that began as a short, humiliating moment for one man unfolded into a larger conversation about how power is perceived and how dignity is enforced. People argued that Marcus's action was performative. Others said it was overdue. But the important thing was that systems changed. The jet resumed service with new protocols. Employees reported feeling safer to speak up about maintenance and fatigue. The most important change, perhaps, was quieter. A culture that began to conjoin competence with compassion. In the end, Marcus realized that the job of leadership is not to be loved but to be right and humane. He did not relish that morning's conflict. He remembered his mother's voice, the small lessons about dignity that had guided him. He also remembered the elderly man who had wanted a window seat and the stewardess who had risked candor. Leadership, as he had always taught his management teams, was about protecting the people beneath your stewardship, even when that meant making decisions that would make noise. When people asked him later whether he regretted the grounding or the firing, he said simply, "I regret none of the choices that restored safety and dignity." That is not to say mistakes won't be made again, but it is to say we chose to correct when we saw them. And somewhere, a culture bent a little then straightened, not because of one man but because people were finally asked to see each other as human beings, not only as positions to be filled. The morning sun spilled gold across the runway as passengers boarded Flight 327 bound for New York. Among them was a calm, sharply dressed man in his late 40s named Marcus Grant. He wasn't loud, nor did he flash wealth, just a man in a sky-blue shirt, a leather carry-on, and quiet confidence in his eyes. Yet beneath that calm exterior was a man who had built one of the largest tech logistics companies in America. Marcus was not only a passenger today. He was, in fact, the owner of the private charter company operating this very jet. But no one at the airport or among the crew knew that. He preferred to travel without special treatment, to see how his employees treated people, not titles. When Marcus approached the plane's entrance, the pilot, a tall, stern-faced woman named Captain Rhodes, glanced at him with suspicion. Her eyes flicked to his economy-class boarding slip, then to his face. "Sir, you must be lost. First class is for our executive passengers only." Marcus smiled politely. "I believe there's been a mistake," he said softly, extending his ticket. Rhodes didn't even look at it. "Sir, this is a private charter. I can't let you sit there. Please move to the back." Other passengers turned to look. Some whispered. The silence of judgment filled the cabin like turbulence before a storm. Marcus took a breath, his composure unbroken. "I was told this seat was available," he said evenly. Captain Rhodes folded her arms, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Not for people who," she paused, then changed tone, "don't belong here." The sting of her words hit the air like ice water. The flight attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but said nothing. Marcus gave a small nod and quietly moved to a seat near the back. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. But something in his eyes shifted, not anger but disappointment. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi, he opened his laptop, typing away calmly. He checked internal performance logs of the charter company, delays, maintenance reports, staff rosters, and yes, Captain Rhodes' name was there. She had a history of passenger complaints, none serious enough to fire her, but enough to draw concern. Marcus sighed. Leadership wasn't just about firing people for mistakes. It was about revealing truth through character. As the plane lifted off, the city below grew small, but a much bigger picture was forming in Marcus's mind.